indeed extremely elated to have you all here with us today. May I now request all the dignitaries to kindly come up and grace the dais. Saraswati Mahabhage, Vidye Kamla Lochane, Vishwarupe Vishalakshi, Vidyam Dehi Namostute। आइए इस सम्मेलन के उद्घाटन समारोह के पवित्र अवसर की शुरुआत करने से पूर्व हम ज्ञान, बुद्धि और कला की देवी मां सरस्वती की ओर अपनी प्रार्थनाएं अर्पित करें।
जीरो पे ही है। क्या करना है? चला दो।
I now request everyone to rise for our university song, the University Kulgeet.
श्रेष्ठ सुंदर दिव्य दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय विहंगम।
जयति जय 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 कान्हा। कुटुंब की भावना सनातन सत्यमों के मंगल दिव्य भावों का समागम।
जय 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 ज्ञान का
महाविद्यालयों के परिसरों से चिर सुशोभित श्रेष्ठ गुरुजन कर रहे छात्र
सदचरिता पावन साधना संकल्प संयम।
नवल वैश्विक चेतना नव क्रांति संस्कारों नवोदगम। जयति जय जय जयति जय जय कान्हा।
विश्वविद्यालय
जयति जय जय जयति जय जय कान्हा।
Thank you, everyone. Kindly take your seat. Invoking the wisdom from the Rig Veda, Anyo Bhadraha Kratuvo Yantu Vishwataha. Let us all be welcoming to the string of wisdom to be imparted by wise men on this dais, and celebrate the spirit of knowledge sharing and enlightenment by paying gratitude to this panel of esteemed personalities here with us today. I hereby take the honor to welcome Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal as our esteemed chief guest for the inaugural ceremony of SSC's International Conference. Mr. Sanyal, a luminary in the field of economics and history, holds the distinguished position of being a member of Economic Advisory Council to the Honorable Prime Minister of Bharat. Previously, he had the singular honor of serving as the principal economic advisor to the finance minister of the country. He played a pivotal role in shaping the economics of the nation in that period. Furthermore, Mr. Sanyal's influence extends globally as he held the prestigious position of co-chair of the G20's Framework Working Group, contributing to the betterment of the global economic order. Conferred with the Young Global Leader title by the World Economic Forum in 2010, Mr. Sanyal is also an accomplished author, known for his best-selling books and numerous articles in leading national and international publications. In his writings, Mr. Sanyal has explored diverse topics, including the need to fill the gaps in historical narratives, the significance of India's maritime heritage, as well as the reflections on concept of complexity theory. These insights, in fact, resonate with the theme of our conference as they underline the importance of Bharatiya Gyan Parampara. Indeed, his visionary insights and tireless efforts have left an indelible mark on India's economic landscape, and the SLC family is deeply honored by his presence here today. Please join me in extending a warm welcome and heartfelt welcome to Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. May I request our Honorable Principal Sir, Professor Ravi Narayan Kar, and our senior faculty member, Professor Neena Shirish, to please welcome our chief guest by presenting a token of gratitude. Thank you, sir and ma'am. We have with us Honorable Mr. P.K. Mishra, Senior Fellow at the Vivekanand International Foundation. Mr. Mishra, with over 4 decades of distinguished service, started as an assistant commandant in the BSF in 1971. Notably, he played a vital role in anti-Naxal operations in West Bengal and received recognitions from the President of India. His impactful contributions continue to shape India's security landscape. I now request our principal, Professor Kar, along with conference director, Professor Ruchika Ramakrishnan, to welcome him with a token of gratitude. Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. हमारे माननीय अतिथि स्वामी श्यामा चैतन्य जी ऋषिकेश में अपने आध्यात्मिक आचार का पालन कर रहे हैं। दिल्ली विश्वविद्यालय से उच्च शिक्षा प्राप्त करने के बाद स्वामी जी ने 10 साल तक वर्ल्ड बैंक में काम किया। अपने कार्यकाल को खत्म करने के बाद वे ऋषिकेश गए, जहां उन्होंने आचार्यों के साथ वेदांत और अन्य ग्रंथों का अध्ययन करना शुरू किया और अपना जीवन शिक्षण, यात्रा और दुखी लोगों की सेवा में अर्पित कर दिया। अब मैं प्रिंसिपल सर और डॉक्टर मुक्ता रोहतगी से निवेदन करती हूँ कि वे हमारे गेस्ट ऑफ ऑनर माननीय स्वामी श्यामा चैतन्य जी का स्नेहपूर्वक स्वागत करें। Thank you, sir. We are honored by the presence of our next esteemed guest, Mr. Professor Muneem Kumar Barai, who is a distinguished professor of finance and director at Ritsu Meikin Center for Asia Pacific Studies at the Asia Pacific University in Japan. Professor Barai's research interests include finance and economic development and has published extensively in reputed journals and edited books. His contributions to the academics are truly commendable. I invite our senior faculty member from Commerce Department, Professor Kavita Arora, and Professor Gayatri Ma'am to honor Professor Muneem Barai, who has joined us today to share knowledge and foster a deeper understanding of Bharat's rich heritage. Thank you, sir and ma'am. Under the visionary leadership of our Honorable Principal Sir, this conference has taken shape as a testament to the rich heritage of Bharatiya Gyan Parampara. His passion for Bharat's ancient wisdom and his dedication to nurturing Puranic Gyan have been the guiding light of all our endeavors in this direction. This is yet another pioneer and successful event organized under his wise guidance. No words will be sufficient to acknowledge his contribution in making the college an institution of learning and development. Call upon Mr. Manoj Kumar, Administration Officer, as well as Mr. Atul Jain, Accounts Officer, to kindly come up the dais and felicitate Thank you all the dignitaries on the dais. Thank you, sir. Stepping forward in today's ceremony, I feel privileged to introduce the theme of the conference to all sitting in this august gathering. Shamlal College has been a beacon of excellence in academics, culture, sports, and various student-empowered activities. The college has been on a journey of steady progress towards academic excellence under the ablest leadership of our principal, Professor Ravi Narayankar. And consistently striving for excellence, the college has been accredited with NAC A++ grade in 2023, along with international recognitions under World's Universities with Real Impact and DBT Star College program. Adding depth to our academic endeavors is SLC's Saraswati IKS Center, founded to preserve and propagate the invaluable knowledge of Bharatiya Gyan Parampara. It delves deep into the various domains of Indian wisdom, fostering an understanding of Bharat's rich heritage. The IKS Center, along with SLC's Department of Commerce, comprising of a significant strength of competent faculty, having extensive research backgrounds and multidisciplinary expertise, convened this conference on the theme of international business and economics of Sub-Sindhu. यह कॉन्फ्रेंस सब सिंधु क्षेत्र के ऐतिहासिक परिवर्तन और वैश्विक प्रभाव की खोज करने का उद्देश्य रखता है, जो 7 प्रमुख नदियों और उन्हीं से उत्पन्न भारतीय सांस्कृतिक पहचान का जन्म स्थल भी है। सब सिंधु क्षेत्र यानी कि सरस्वती, सिंधु, रावी, झेलम, चेनाब, सतलुज और ब्यास इस क्षेत्र का बहुत ही समृद्ध इतिहास और संस्कृति है। इस संगठन पर हर भारतीय को गर्व है। ये कॉन्फ्रेंस हमें इस धरोहर के प्रासंगिक प्रभाव को समझने का अवसर देता है और इस कॉन्फ्रेंस के द्वारा हमें भारत की गहरी ज्ञान प्रणालियों, सांस्कृतिक धरोहर एवं वैश्विक आर्थिक परिस्थितियों को भारतीय ज्ञान परंपरा के संदर्भ में समझने का एक मौका मिलेगा। विशेष रूप से हमारे सम्मेलन का थीम इस वर्ष के G20 मीट के अनुरूप भी है, जिसमें वसुधैव कुटुंबकम दृष्टिकोण का पालन करते हुए भारत ने अपने पौराणिक ज्ञान परंपरा के द्वारा समावेशी विकास और सहयोग के प्रति अपने अटूट समर्पण का पूरे विश्व भर के सामने प्रदर्शन किया। Thus, taking this spirit forward, we have scheduled 3 plenary sessions featuring inspiring talks by our experts and academicians. Further, we are delighted to share with you that we have received an overwhelming contribution of research papers under this theme from national and international scholars, of which only 28 papers have been shortlisted by our panel of experts to be presented today. Now, I request the pilot of this conference, Honorable Professor Ravi Narayankar sir, to kindly share a few insights on the theme of this conference and encourage the participants. Please, sir.
Namaskar to respected guests on the dais, Honorable Chief Guest of the Day, Shri Sanjeev Sanyalji, the guest of honor, Shri P.K. Mishraji, Swami Shamanandji, Professor Momin Boraiji, convener of the conference, Dr. Mukta Rohtagi, teacher in charge of the Commerce Department, Professor Ruchika Ramakrishnan, Director IQAC and Saraswati IKS Center, Professor Kushal Tiwari, my dear colleagues coming from different colleges, institutions of University of Delhi and other parts, participants, and my dear fellow students. I welcome you all to this prestigious inaugural ceremony of the International Business and Economics of Sapta-Sindhu, a historical transformation and global impact. It is indeed an honor and privilege to stand before you today and share some of my thoughts on the significance of this remarkable event. And just to take you a little bit backward in the aftermath of the hugely successful G20 summit at Delhi, it is a testimony to the global impact of the land of the Sapta-Sindhu, that is Bharat. On this auspicious moment, I congratulate the Commerce Department, IQAC and Saraswati IQAC Center for coming together and conceiving this idea of this conference. I once again extend a very warm welcome to the August gathering. A huge round of applause for all of you. In the spirit of our conference, let us begin by invoking the wisdom from the Yajurveda, Yatra Vishwam Bhavatikta Nidam, where the whole world becomes one family. This profound philosophy, ingrained in our Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, signifies the universal outlook of our nation, and it resonates today and more than ever. When it comes to finding answer to what the history holds up for today, Bharat surely has a reservoir to offer. The land of Saptasindhu takes pride in being a land of rich culture and heritage, soil of spiritual awakening, a place that taught the world how to do business, a kingdom of one of the finest architectural marvels of the world. Not only this, we have given to the world one of the most exotic spices, the finest textiles and jewels to glorify the richness of kings around the world. How can one forget that the base of the mathematics, that is the zero, we have given to this world? Our traditional business models have always been sustainable and knew how to manage the abundance of resources we are blessed with. It had rooted in the vast and rich knowledge base, the skills, water management, temple administration, and local architecture. So many evidences of expertise in international trade, both from the east to the west coast to the Silk Route, and the expertise in navigation and maritime affairs, which allowed us to explore and trade with nations across the areas. Bharati business principles and models throw light on important managerial aspects also. As per our scripture, the purpose of business should be governed by the concept of Sarvaloka Hitam, or the benefit of all the stakeholders, and should duly reflect in the mission and vision of the organization. The aspect of dharma should steer the core philosophy of the organization and act as the means through which people associated with the perspectives of the organization. Vasudevam Kutumbakam should be the basis of our partnerships. Thus, this conference is not just a congregation of scholars and experts. It is a celebration of Bharat's great Gyan and cultural heritage. It is an opportunity to explore, understand, and contribute to the economic and cultural design of Saptasindhu, and to connect to the future. Our theme, underpinning the geography of Saptasindhu, reminds us of the 7 great rivers of our land, which have nurtured and nourished our civilization for ages. It is the heart of this land that is Bharat, and not just a piece of geography, because it is a repository of ancient wisdom and melting pot of diverse culture, as you said, Sanjal Sir, again and again. In this context, it is essential to recognize the incredible depth and relevance of the Bharatiya Gyan Parampara. Our knowledge systems have not just endured the test of time, they have flourished and left an indelible mark on the global stage. Speaking of global resonance, I cannot help but mention Bharat's recent presidency at the G20, where our nation played a pivotal role in shaping global economic policies. Further, we are honored to have distinguished guests, intellectuals, educated luminaries, students in history, economics, and Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, who will grace our conference with their deep insights on Bharatiya Gyan Parampara, commerce, education, economics, history. So this multidimensional impacts and their wisdom and expertise will enrich our discussions and contribute to the deliberations. Concluding my address, I encourage each participant actively to engage in intellectual discourses, because this conference is not just a hub of knowledge, but a celebration of our heritage. Let us celebrate the past, but also chart a course for a brighter future. And National Education Policy 2020 beautifully laid out a roadmap for all of us and given us ample opportunities to bring this great knowledge over to the classrooms and prepare our students for future, so that we will regain our past glory by celebrating as a superpower by 2047. And I'm so pleased to listen to my students yesterday and some of the presenters who, on the occasion of Students' Colloquium, starting from temple economics to heritage economics to urban planning to entrepreneurship, all the papers are marvelous. And I'm so happy for that, that the future is so bright for all of us. A huge round of applause for all of them. Once again, I extend a very warm welcome to all of you. And lastly, I would like to thank our chairperson, Shamlal College governing body, Madam Savita Gupta, for all the necessary support, and congratulate the Commerce Department led by Professor Ruchika, Dr. Mukhtar Hurtegi, Professor Pusha Tiwari, Director IQAC and Saraswati IKS Center, and their team for organizing this conference, and also our administrative officer and section officer administration for ensuring the seamless handling of all the modalities of successful organization of this conference. Namaskar. Thank you all. Namaskar.
Sir, we are indeed grateful to you for bringing out instances from Bharatiya Gyan Parampara in pertinence to the conference theme and presenting the idea of Model Bharat by 24/7. Now, I request all the dignitaries on the dais to call open the conference by releasing the book of abstracts.
Date of year डालना होता है नंबर नहीं 4 अक्षर कैपिटल
Thank you everyone for that auspicious inauguration. It is now time to hear words of wisdom and enlightenment from our star-studded panel today. Mr. Mishra is invited to share a couple of words to encourage the participants. Please, sir.
Respected guests, because I am a partner person of my college, and brothers and sisters, I am a Fauji. Speaking about history of India and Sapta Sindhu, I will take you to these areas because I deal with the terrain itself. Okay, I take you to Larkana. That's what Mohenjo-daro Harappa was there. By the way, I forgot slightly how to start. Let me start it again. Saraswati Namastubhyam Bharate Kamarupi Vishwarupi Vishalaki Vidyandehi Saraswati Ajnanatimidandhasya Jnananjana Sarakaya Chakshumritanyena Tasmai Sri Gurave Namah. Yes, I will take you to Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. My all experts will brief you more about that, but I will tell you the exact place. When I visited it with my friends of Park Rangers, they took me. That is at Larkana. Here I will tell you when I went to Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, that's in Larkana, I saw it there. The way this, the canals were there, the drainage system was there, it's fantastic. Which we are doing it now in our country, the drainage system, and in fact they have counted 700, that's about 700 wells are there in Mohenjo-daro. One has to learn, how come before 3000 BC, those times, the Bharatians, they made it there. So of course it is now in Pakistan, but it was there in Bharat. That's what is Sanatan Dharma. That's what is Hindustan. That's what is Hindu. and that was its Indus, and that's what is Saptarishi, and that's what is Sapt Sindhu. Sat Mere, Sat Sabd, rainbow colors, and
नहीं आएगा फुल
Sat Janam. That is what it was. It is embedded in our genes of all Bharatiyas.
इससे ज्यादा नहीं
Take you to, from that place I take you to Taxila. Now Taxila, I was very fortunate again to visit Taxila, the place of Chanakya, and the place where the Greeks, the Arabians, and the Chinese and Babylon, all these experts, they used to come to learn Vedas, our all four Vedas, and that is where Arthashastra was written by Chanakya, the Taxila. It's a famous place, and I also request my friends in the gathering, if anybody is interested to visit Taxila, maybe 50 kilometers from Rawalpindi, I will arrange for that visit. Nothing, there will be no problem. It's better to know, go there, study it, how it was there, how the, you see, all these three big libraries were there. Taxila, of course, not that much better than Nalanda, but I have seen at Nalanda. Two more points, I know I have this time. Two more points I'll tell you. That's about the Sarda pit in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, and the Sarda mutt which is there in our side at Titwal. Nice of it. I was deployed at Titwal. I have seen the Sarda mutt at Titwal. Nice of it that our Prime Minister Raj, again it was ruined, but that has been made up now, and it is a big place of visit in Titwal. So I request my friends again, if somebody is interested to go and see Sarda mutt in Indian side at Titwal, very close to opposite side of Kale and Muzaffarabad, you are welcomed. I will manage your visit also. Thanks, gentlemen and ladies. I just wanted to share my views because I mean, both I have gone to these places. I thought of telling it. Thank you then. All the best.
Thank you, sir, for sharing insights from your experiential learning. The mantra, sure, they purified our mind, body, and soul. While we will be hearing from Professor Muneem Dorais sharing deep insights on the theme in the consecutive plenary session, I now invite him to encourage the participants present here for the inauguration ceremony. Please, sir.
Good morning. I hope all of you are fine, doing fine. Today is the day for us to listen to our chief guest, Mr. Sandeep Sannal. From outside, in fact, we see some very young faces in India, those who are encouraging whole Indians, as all Indians, whole world, to see India differently, not by the vision created by some of the historians, and he's one of them. And I'm very encouraged by his presence, also by his deliberations, in fact, today. So yesterday I told you about my kind of view on India, and I said that, well, every big misfortune even, or say World War type of thing, brought changes, permanent changes, and Ukraine war has created a moment for the world where you find that one moment for India has come. And this is the time we call it the Indian moment. In 1990s, we found Chinese phenomenon. In 2023, it is India's moment. And India's moment could be seen in different ways. First, I have to say that, well, by all projections, India will be second largest economy by 2075. But somehow I believe it could be even earlier if India takes the opportunity. And I think you might have heard the word of Mr. Madison report. That is the report, seminal work by Professor Madison. in that work, we find that from one BD, after birth of peace, up to 1700, it was India which was dominating the world in terms of GDP per capita. And after that, we have seen the rise of China. And after that, it was the Western Europe, including those powers we are seeing today. But I think this is revisiting. By 2023, we are finding after China, it's again India rising. So after 200 or 300, after that kind of thing, India is in the picture. And G20 has shown that yes, India is rising. India has a global face. At the time, it's Global South's leader, and hope it will be again #1 in this century, so that it becomes an Indian century. And you will be the light bearers, and we have the historian, come economist, will be telling you all these things again. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Rogi, for giving me the chance to talk here. And I'm very glad to see you. And hopefully in the future we'll be meeting again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Let us all step into the moment we have been curiously waiting for and gathered for. May I request the chief guest, Mr. Sanyal, sir, to join us at the podium to deliver his enlightening insights with us and enrich our conference.
Thank you very much. And a very good morning to everyone. Professor Ravi Narayan Kaur, Principal, Mr. P.K. Mishra, Swami Shamananji, Professor Barai, organizers of this event, Professors Usha, Ruchika, and Mukta, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. The topic I said I will talk about is about a brief history of Indian theory of governance and economics. I thought this would be an appropriate topic because a lot is said about Indian contributions to Indian intellectual contributions, but very often these contributions, particularly in the area of economics and governance, tend to end up at best as a discussion about Kautilya's Arthashastra at most. And even that is, you get the impression that it is somehow one document that was created in thin air and that there is nothing before it and nothing after that. This is not the case. India actually has a very long and rich tradition of thinking about governance. And I'm going to give you a flavor of this. Forgive me that I'm going to skip a lot because it is an overview, but it will give you a flavor of the deep and interesting thoughts that have happened in this field over very long periods of time. After all, we are the world's oldest living civilization, and we have a long history of kingdoms, republics, and other things that have existed for a long time. So not surprisingly, we thought a lot about prosperity, governance, and these issues. So what I'm going to do is give you a flavor of this. Notice here that this is not a history of architecture of government. So to the extent that this literature, academic literature exists on Indian theory of governance, it tends to go into, you know, how the layers of bureaucracy functioned and so on. Whether something was a republic or it was a kingdom and so on. What I'm going to talk about is about the Indian theory of governance, i.e. what did these people want to achieve, whether they were a republic or a kingdom or had a bureaucracy or had Mansabdari system or whatever. What is it that they were trying to achieve? What were the principles they used? That is what I'm going to talk about. Now, let us go right to the beginning of Indian history. So Indian history begins with two separate sources of this knowledge. One is the Vedic texts, and the other is the archaeological remains of the Harappan civilization, or otherwise known as the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization. There is now increasing archaeology on the Gangetic plains as well, which goes back to the Bronze Age. So this we now have this huge corpus of information. There is a lot of controversy still there about how all these different branches of information, whether the Vedic texts and the Harappan archaeology are linked to each other. I have very strong views on that. Some of you may be well aware of this. But today I'm not going to get into that because I am going to focus just on the governance part of it. And unfortunately on this, there is relatively little information that you can make up. So for example, if you take the Vedic text, then what do we know from the Vedic text is that the Vedic tribes were ruled by a chieftain, the Rajan, and that he had to support him a Samiti, which was a grand assembly of the tribe, and a Sabha, which was an executive council. Beyond that, unfortunately, we can't say very much. Now notice, however, that these meanings have switched. Today, Samiti means a small executive council or committee or something like that, and a Sabha is a grand assembly. But again, even if we today had that information, that we have an executive council and Sabha, it would tell us still nothing about how the actual country was run or those kingdoms were run. And that is basically the situation we have. So we know about the form of government, but nothing about the principles of government. Now from the Harappan archaeology, we have the opposite problem. We know that there was a lot of emphasis on, for example, municipal issues. We know there was a lot of issues about, they took a lot of interest in standardizing various municipal weights, measures, size of bricks and so on. But we have no idea how they arrived at this. We know at best that they had an elite, because almost all the large sites have an upper town which is clearly better constructed. There are larger towns, the larger buildings and dwellings in that upper town, which is very often fortified. But again, other than knowing that there was an elite, we can say nothing about what are the principles they used, what is the basis on which they were doing this governance. We do not know. Now, those who believe that the Vedic civilization coincided with the Harappans, one could argue that these upper town of the Harappans was where the Sabha and the Samiti met. But that's just conjecture. So we really have to move on to the next era to get a better sense of what were people actually thinking about governance. And here we end up in the Iron Age. So here we are moving from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. And in the Iron Age, and again, I'm not getting into the debate about dating this at all because that's not my focus. We end up with two great testimonies of that time. And these are the Itihasas or the epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And here we do get fairly more explicit discussions about governance. Particularly, for example, you have the Raj Dharma Parva of the Mahabharata. And there, Bhishma lying on the bed of arrows discusses with Yudhishthir the various principles of governance. And similarly in the Ramayana, for example, in the Balkand in particular, you have descriptions of Dasharath's kingdom and so on. So you have some sense of what these kingdoms thought about, what the kingdoms of the time were, what the principles of governance. But again, it's not a very systematic laying out of principles. They are more in the form of aphorisms and statements. It doesn't say how you arrived at those statements. Or what was the framework for thinking by which you came to those conclusions. So you really have to work hard to figure out what their overall understanding of governance was in a second order sense by looking at the concepts that they are talking about. So in the Mahabharata in particular, but also in the Ramayana, one major concept pops up. And that concept is that of Matsya Nyaya. So what is Matsya Nyaya? The Matsya Nyaya is the idea that the big fish eat the small fish. This is like the law of the jungle. And the basic point is that the basic point is that the state or the king needs to exist in order to avoid Matsya Nyaya. So this is a very important core idea that is there in both the epics, that the state exists to avoid Matsya Nyaya. And how do you go about arriving at avoiding Matsya Nyaya? Well, that is done by the state following dharma. Now, of course, the problem is that this word dharma is a very general word. It is used and misused in a variety of ways. And so again, it's very difficult to easily arrive at working out what did they mean by dharma. There are some like Professor Meenakshi Jain who will argue that it was a form of common law system which similar to what is practiced in British colonies, including India, which allowed for contextualized and evolving solutions of governance. So this was not a rigid code like many may think, like Dharma Shastras. The Dharma Shastras, at least in my view, were at best embodies of enforceable law. At best, they were opinions for reference. So how did they actually rule these kingdoms? Again, we can't really tell this because this is not clearly enunciated. So this is the problem with all the discussions pre-Arthashastra, and that is why very many people end up with discussing the Arthashastra, because you have to work rather hard to work out what these principles were. But if you read both the epics, you do find some interesting insights into how the frameworks of thinking work. So one of the frameworks of thinking that seems to come through, i.e. the basis of dharma in the Ramayana, is all about the enforcement of contracts and promises. So that's why Pran Jai par Bachana na jai, right? So you see in Ramayana, what happens? What is the Ramayana arguing about governance? Basically saying that the rules must be obeyed, contracts and promises must be enforced, even when they're unfair. So clearly in the Ramayana stage of the Iron Age, which is so, the Ramayana is older than the Mahabharata. So from the Vedic age, you have arrived at the stage where the thinking of that time is the law must be enforced, the contracts must be enforced. That is the thinking, and the Ramayana basically makes a case for this. So you see throughout the Ramayana, Ram is forced to enforce contracts and keep promises which are clearly unfair, and they are clearly to his disadvantage. Right? So he's sent away to the forest to enforce a promise that his father gave to one of his stepmothers. Nowhere does the Ramayana try to make a case that it is fair. It is clear it's unfair, but he has to follow it. Throughout the subsequent periods, you keep seeing this happening. And in fact, you see that an entire new section is added to the Ramayana, which is called Uttar Ramayana. This is about what happens to Ram after he returns from Vanvas and begins to rule his kingdom. So remember, this part of the Ramayana is actually not a part of the original Valmiki Ramayana, but is added many centuries later. And in this additional part, so somebody actually added an extra part in which the case is made that as king, Ram had to actually send his wife away, Sita, his beloved wife away, Sita, because the law said so. Again, the Ramayana at no case tries to make the case that this was fair. It is, even in the Ramayana, clearly stated as unfair. But he has to do this. Why does he do this? Because the point being made is that a prosperous kingdom, i.e. Ram Rajya, is based on a system where the ruler also applies the laws to themselves. So this is the case being made. So Ram Rajya is not utopia, right? It is not the kingdom of heaven in, say, the Abrahamic sense. It is not. It is simply a place where the rulers apply the law to themselves, and this leads to prosperity, leads to happiness of the people in general, but it doesn't lead to the happiness of the rulers, mind you. Ram, by the way, lives in utter misery. He misses his wife. He feels guilty about the whole thing. But the point being made is, for the betterment of society, even a great king Ram, why was he great? Because he applied the laws to himself. Now, by the time the Mahabharata comes around, there is obviously a questioning of this line of thought. And so the Mahabharata actually makes the opposite case. So in the Mahabharata, you have a person like Ram, but now it is Yudhishthira. And he too, like Ram, applies the law irrespective of whether it is fair. But unlike in the Ramayana, where it leads to a good outcome, here it ultimately leads to a great war. So the Mahabharata is saying that if you blindly apply the law, irrespective of whether it's a good law or a bad law, then you will end up with the Kurukshetra war. So in the Mahabharata, you have Krishna, who is the avatar of the same God, who twists the law to serve natural justice. The law says that the Kauravas, having won Draupadi in the game of dice, they can disrobe her in public if they wish, because they now own her. Nobody is making the case that it is a good law, but that is what the law is. Now Krishna, however, twists the law. The law is followed in the sense that they're allowed to, the law says they can try and disrobe her. There's no law about the length of the sari. So this repeatedly shows through, even in the war. For example, how Arjun avenges the death of Abhimanyu. Again, the law is followed, but it is twisted by Krishna in a particular way. So you have here a very interesting debate on governance, which has not yet been resolved to this day. The difference between the letter of the law and natural justice, or the spirit of the law. And this is, to this day, an unresolved issue, because both of them, there is a case to be made, and both of them do not necessarily lead to, it's not easy under every circumstances that they will lead to good outcomes. So this is a friction that the Ramayana and Mahabharata clearly bring out about the nature of governance. Now more time passes. Now we are into the late Iron Age, and we are now coming into the edges of the historical age. And now more and more thinkers come. In fact, there are two schools of thought that emerge out of all this thinking. And two schools of two rishis who are actually mentioned in the Mahabharata, Shukra and Brihaspati. But the texts of the Mahabharata do not clarify what the difference between the two schools are. So it is now that we begin to see these schools become much more clear. Now, who are Brihaspati and Shukra? Shukra is the guru of the Asuras, and Brihaspati is the guru of the Devas. Now, it is very important to remember that in the early age, this idea that the Asuras are bad, Devas are good, it doesn't exist. They're just gods and anti-gods. They are in tension with each other, but they are all both important. Both of them are invited to do the Samudra Manthan, for example. So they are opposites, but both of them, by the way, are worshipped in the Vedic period. Varuna, Rudra, all of these are actually Asuras. They are not Devas. It's later that they are converted into Devas because of as thinking evolves in a different direction. So what do these two schools of Shukra and Brihaspati say? Now the problem here is we don't actually have surviving texts from them. There are few surviving texts, the Brihaspati Sutra and the Shukra Niti Sara do exist in very corrupted form, to the extent that you cannot actually tell what their original thinking was from those texts. But we can tell from other texts that the Shukra school basically were legalists. They believed in Dandaniti, i.e. the law and the imposition of the law was the basis of enforcement of the law, was the basis of good governance. So the Shukra people would say, government's job is create the law, create good courts, and make sure that the regulators and the courts enforce these laws. That is good governance. The Brihaspati school, however, disagrees with it. They say, yes, you need to do this too, but it is not enough to just have laws. You also need policies. So particularly economic policy, which is called Varta. So this is the difference between the two schools. Now, this is the intellectual context in which Kautilya emerges in the 4th century BC. Now, the reason I told you this long history is so that you understand that Kautilya didn't appear from ether or vacuum, intellectual vacuum. He starts the Kautilya Arthashastra by first giving salutations to both Shukra and to Brihaspati. So this is very interesting. Today we do referencing. Do remember that in the Kautilya Arthashastra, he starts by acknowledging those who came before him. And throughout the text, he mentions other scholars. And sometimes he says he agrees with them, sometimes he disagrees with them. But this idea that Kautilya got up and began to write is not true. He creates a system of referencing where he clearly refers back to these earlier thinkers. And in this Arthashastra, which by the way literally means the treatise on wealth or prosperity, or economics, whichever way you want to prefer to call it. He is writing about how to run an idealized kingdom. Now, Kautilya, remember, is not just any old person. He's, of course, when he's putting this together initially, he is a professor at Takshashila University on political economy, and he would go on to create India's first historically attested empire, the Mauryan Empire. So he is one of the co-founders of a major global empire, along with Chandragupta Maurya, who was his student. And so he leaves us this text called the Arthashastra, which is, of course, extraordinary because it is written by a person who is not just a theoretician, but also a major practitioner. And in that text, he leaves us very interesting ideas. Now, unfortunately, Kautilya's Arthashastra, those who don't read it, know it mostly from stories about spies and the mandala theory and so on. But in fact, it is a very small part of his text. Most of his text is on economics and governance. He talks extensively about taxation, about consumer rights, about regulating and encouraging industry. He talks about urban planning, how to design taxation systems, and stuff like this. Almost all of the book is about this. There's a very small section on mandala theory. And so this is what the Arthashastra is about. Now, in the Arthashastra, however, he gives us a very good sense of the intellectual framework right in the first chapter. So what does he say? He says that in order to govern a country, you need to have the 4 areas of knowledge. So he says the first area of knowledge is Dandaniti, which is the rule of law. Second, Varta, which is economic and commercial policy. Then he says you need to also know Anvikshiki, which is the philosophical framework. So he says not good enough to have laws and policy. You need a philosophical framework. Even today, we need a philosophical framework. Are you a capitalist? Are you a socialist? Do you believe in creative destruction and Austrian school? Whatever it is, you need a philosophical framework based on which you run the country. And then finally he says you need to also know Trade, which literally means the 3 Vedas, but more broadly it means the cultural context. So you need to have the laws and the policies and all this sort of things, but you have to apply them in a certain cultural context. So you also need Trade. Now, what he does is then says who are the other people who are the various schools, and then it is he who clearly tells us what the different schools of thought think. So he says the school of Shukra only focuses on Dandini. He says the school of Brihaspati talks about Varta, which is policy, and Danditi, law. Then he says there's the school of Manu. So there is obviously a new school that has got inserted along the way. And he says the school of Manu says accepts Varta, it accepts Dandiniti, but then it only thinks that Trey is needed but not Anvikshiki, because it thinks that the cultural context is good enough to tell you the philosophical context. And then he says, Kautilya says finally, that he himself, however, thinks that all 4 are important. Law is important, policy is important, philosophical framework is important, and the cultural context is important, and it is separate from the philosophical context. So this is where the Arthashastra starts, and then of course it goes on to give a long list of policies, etc. But what is he really arguing for? The main thing that comes together very clearly from Kautilya's text that he's a realist, he's not an idealist. And he argues essentially for a strong but limited state. He doesn't state it quite the way I'm stating it, but he argues for a strong but limited state. Now, what does that mean? He basically says that the state has the following limited agenda. It should care about internal and external security and threats. It should administer justice, provide infrastructure and municipal services. It should regulate and encourage commercial and economic activity, and it should collect taxes. Kautilyan state does not allow for any laxity in any of them. He does not have any sense of humor about all of this. But he's very clear what the state does. However, he is not a welfareist. He does not, he is suspicious of allowing officials to interfere in daily lives. And he is clear that doing all of this is the secret to avoiding Matsyanya. Now, does the state have a role in providing support? Yes, it does, but only in terms of providing support during emergencies like relief during natural calamities and so on. In general, he does not see the role of the state in doing general welfareism except under these natural calamities and things like that. So he is not a welfarist. He's not an idealist. He is very clearly a realist. And this is the basis on which he runs the state. But why does Kautilya limit the state? Kautilya limits the state because he's extremely suspicious of bureaucrats. So, have this view that Kautilya has all these spy networks and all of this. But it's very clear that these spy networks were either directed towards external threats or towards the officials of the state itself. They're not directed towards general citizens. This is very clear. And the reason for this is that Kautilya limits the Indian state for a reason that is very Indian. So he's not the only philosopher ever to talk about limiting the state. But in the Western philosophical tradition about limiting the state, the usual argument is from the perspective of natural freedoms or natural rights of the individual. That is the reason Western philosophical tradition limits the state. Kautilya, however, has a very Indian reason for limiting the spreading of the state. His reason is corruption. He's extremely suspicious of this, and he says this also. He says, just as it is impossible to know when a fish is drinking water while it is swimming, it is also impossible to find out when a government servant misappropriates money. And then he applies this in various places. So if you see, for example, when he's talking about economic policy, he states, the king shall promote trade and commerce by setting up trade routes by land and by water, as well as market towns and ports. Trade routes shall be kept free from harassment from courtiers, state officials, thieves, and frontier guards, and from damage by herds of cattle. Now, since I'm now a civil servant, let me say, it's rather concerning that one of my heroes, Kautilya, would have put me somewhere between a thief and a herd of cattle. But the general principle is very clear. You must regulate rather than ban various kinds of activities, and the officials must be very tightly controlled and not allowed to interfere with the lives of the average citizen too much. Now 2 generations pass and the Mauryan Empire flourishes. But then it is taken over by a rebel called Ashoka. We all know Ashoka as the Great today, but let me say that he was not just a rebel in terms of how he took over the kingdom, which I'll come to, but in terms of also he actually turns Kautilya's dictum and way of functioning on its head. So that you know who Ashoka was, do remember that Ashoka was actually not the person who was supposed to take over the kingdom. He was actually a usurper who kills all his brothers and took over the kingdom, and in fact he was famous for being extremely cruel. Now this bit is not disputed. What then the usual story goes is that he then invaded Kalinga, and shocked by his own cruelty, he then became a pacifist and a Buddhist. Now many people do not realize this, that this story is entirely made up. There is actually no evidence for him becoming a pacifist ever. There's more than adequate evidence that he was a Buddhist when he invaded Kalinga. 4 years before Kalinga, he had already converted to Buddhism. After invading Kalinga, he did carry out all these massacres, that is attested. But the fact that he became a pacifist is actually not attested anywhere. This is utterly made up 100 years ago by some people who wanted to kind of raise him as being a great kingdom from the past and proto-socialist. And I will tell you why they thought he would be a good role model. So they just invented this idea of him becoming a pacifist. So usually you will have this passage which you have where he is mentioned that, you know, I've carried out these massacres, but now I have become feeling very sorry about having carried out these massacres in Kalinga and so on and so forth. Now this paragraph of regret that everybody reads in their textbooks, let me tell you a little bit about it. Note that no edict in Odisha carries this regret. Now, if you were so regretful, the one place you would express this regret is in the place where you carried out the massacre. No, this is only mentioned in a edict that is there now in what is now Pakistan. Very far away, as possible, in fact, from Odisha. And even there, in the very next paragraph, so you have to know the context in which he says it. He says, notwithstanding the regret I'm feeling towards what I did in Kalinga, if you forest tribes behave badly, I will do the same thing to you. So it is actually a threat. If you don't believe what I'm saying, just go up and read these edicts yourself. It is an exact. But I'm not here to talk about his pacifism. I'm here to talk about his governance. What happens is that Kautilya, as you remember, was essentially thought of his kingdom as a limited law enforcer of the law, a restrained enforcer of the law, and a person who carried out various kinds of policies. He did not want his officials, he was suspicious of his officials, didn't want them to be doing any welfareism, because he generally was of the view that these people will just siphon off the money. But you have here suddenly a completely different view of the role of the state that you have. So in the edicts, you will find Ashoka come up with this idea, all men are my children. And then he literally argues for a welfarist nanny state, and he says, just as parents entrust their child to a wet nurse, the Rajuka officials shall be appointed by me for the welfare and happiness of the people. Now, Kautilya would have been shocked by this statement, because as far as he was concerned, these Rajuka officials were the most suspicious people. Then, Ashoka then goes on to state, he gives a large number of these rules which interfere with daily life. And I'll give you another example, which you can also read up yourself. He says, on the 8th day of every fortnight, on the 14th and 15th, on the Tissa, on the Purnavasu, the 3 Chaturmasis and other auspicious days, bulls are not to be castrated. Goats, rams, boars and other animals are not to be castrated. On Tissa, Purnavasu and the 4th of Chaturmasi, horses and bullocks are not to be branded. Now again, this is very different from the practical rule making of the Arthashastra. What difference does it make to the bull? The realist Kautilya would have wondered what day of the month that he is castrated. I mean, Kautilya would have just laughed at all of this, saying this is just garbage. What happens as a result of Ashoka's new policies, however, are very real. This first experiment by India on big government ends in absolute disaster. And this is also not debated. The Arthashastra and Kautilya created the empire of the Mauryans. The same empire collapsed while Ashoka was still alive. So we have no idea why he's considered the great, because he usurped the empire he did not create. And while he was still alive, the empire collapsed. We know for a fact that there were large numbers of rebellions all across the country while he was alive. There was a fiscal collapse while he was alive. And while he was alive, his own family began to kill each other as he was lying in his deathbed. His own family began to, in fact, his favorite son was blinded by his favorite wife and so on and so forth. So it was a pretty sordid end to the Mauryan Empire. And within a few years of Ashoka's death, the empire completely collapsed. So the point I'm making to you is a good warning to all those who believe in fiscal expansion. Now, the ideas of Kautilya are not forgotten despite the collapse of the empire. In fact, perhaps because of the collapse of the empire, he now becomes a legend. So in subsequent empires, Kautilya's Arthashastra is very heavily read, studied, commented upon. And you see this even 600 years later when you have the Gupta Empire arising. They very much try to model themselves on the Mauryan lines. In fact, two of their greatest kings, Chandragupta I and Chandragupta Vikramaditya, are named in fact after the Mauryan king Chandragupta. And there are many things about, there are many plays, for example, Mudra Rakshas, etc., which are about the Mauryan. So the Guptas of imperial Guptas are fascinated by the imperial Mauryas, not surprisingly. So it's not surprising that their thinkers also remembered Kautilya and Chanakya and so on. And you have a text from this period called Kamandak's Niti Sara, which talks about what, many of these ideas. So he, again, very interestingly, since I talked about referencing, he begins the text by referencing Brihaspati, Shukra, and now, since he's now the legend, Vishnugupta Chanakya, as the people from which he's got his ideas. So, and many of these ideas now he pushed forward. But it's also interesting that there are some small differences. Now remember, Kautilya is the founder of an empire. Niti Sara is written at the time when the Gupta Empire is already well established. So Kamandak is writing for an audience which is of an established empire, not an empire that is just being created or to be created. So it's quite interesting how that changes perspective. So Kautilya was very open to getting new talent in. Whereas you can clearly see subliminally Kamandak has this preference for aristocrats. So he's obviously we don't know exactly who was, but it's likely he was a scholar or a minister in an established system. So you can clearly see the elite is already trying to establish itself. So there are these small differences, but nonetheless, many of the basic ideas of the Kautilya are continued. Now we are reaching the medieval period, and here you begin to see by the 10th, 11th century, many of Kautilya's ideas are there, but you can also see a certain fossilization of our thinking. And you see that in Somadeva's Niti, Vyakyam, Mritam, Bhoja's Yukti, Niti Sara. They're simply not of the same caliber as Kautilya. There is a lot of statements here, but we are already going back to the old aphorism style rather than clinical thinking. So, for example, Somdeva, which is a Jain text, by the way, from the 10th century, he says, a minister who is spendthrift and generates little revenue eats away the wealth of the king. Now, I agree, this is probably a statement about fiscal rectitude, but point I'm making is that is very different from the systematic thinking of Kautilya's Arthashastra. It is a series of dictums rather than systematic framework of thought. So you already can see that I've kind of wavered away. And of course, after this, what happens is that the old civilization goes through this major shock of the Turkic invasions, and the great universities of Nalanda and so on are burnt down. Takshila, of course, was burnt down earlier in the 4th century, and so on. And so there is this big shock to the system. But I'm sure there were new ideas, texts, etc. written. Unfortunately, we do not know what many of these texts from this period actually say, because not enough research has been done. And this is something that young scholars here should really take upon themselves. There are 4 lakh manuscripts lying untranslated in the National Manuscript Vision. I'm quite certain there are many texts in there about governance, but nobody is paying serious attention to them. Unfortunately, it is one of the bizarre things is that this effort to go out there and translate ancient medieval texts actually declines after independence. there were actually a greater effort happening towards translating these texts and taking them more seriously in the pre-independence period, not just in the princely states, but even in British-controlled India. And after independence, we seem to have lost all interest in this. So one of the ideas behind conferences like this is to get young scholars to go out there. There's a huge piles of material. You can make your careers out of them. There's so much material out there that you can go out and dig for. There is also texts, by the way, from the Mughal period, which come, like Abul Fazl, Aini, Akbari, and so on. But again, we have this problem here that it doesn't delve into the principles of governance. It gives you long lists about how the structure of governance works. So it tells you about the, Aini Akbari has all kinds of things, information about customs of the time, history, levels of government, wages of laborers, even the cost of house building it has. So it's quite a rich text. But somebody will have to really sit in there and dig out what are the principles of governance, because it doesn't, unlike the Arthashastra, it does not lay out the principles of governance. I'm quite certain, like I have done for the Mahabharata and Ramayana, somebody reading through it could probably lean it out, but this is work that somebody needs to do. Now we end up here in the colonial period. And here there is an interesting text that is written on the principles of government by a remarkable person called Raja Madhav Rao. Now, Raja Madhav Rao, he gave a set of lectures in 1881 to Sayaji Rao Gaikwad III, who was the young Maharaja of Baroda, whose Prime Minister Madhav Rao was. So you had this young prince, so he gave these lectures, and these lectures are called Hints on the Art and Science of Government. There is a very good translation recently available. So you can, by somebody called Rahul Sagar, so you can pick up that translation on, it's a recent one, I think published in 2022. So you can pick it up and you'll read through them, but it's quite interesting to read through it. Because in there, you can clearly see many of these old ideas going back all the way to the Iron Age are still alive. There's still the idea of Rajadharma, of Matsya Nyaya and so on. But at the same time, times have changed. So the application of these ideas have now to be done in a different context, because Sayaji Gaikwad is under a situation where he has limited sovereignty. He's functioning under British colonial overlordship. So this is the times have changed. Also times have changed because unlike in the past where there was a judicial system, but the king was the ultimate top of the system in a sense. So it wasn't entirely independent in that sense. And both almost all the ancient schools of thought basically thought of the king as being a restrained enforcer of the law. But now that you have a judicial system that is the enforcer of the law, the role of the king has changed. And so Madhav Rao states this, as you can see, because the legal system, modern judicial system is being created. So he now states how the young prince to think about this. So he says, now that we have succeeded in establishing in these territories a series of judicial tribunals, such as the country requires, the judicial tribunals have been working well and fulfilling their objectives. So let me inform your highness of the clear result of my study and experience, namely that any Maharaja who undertakes to administer public justice personally must inevitably fail. So you can see, you have here the old traditions coming at one side, but at the same time, modernity has crept in. The idea of separation of the judiciary to becoming independent has come, and he's warning the prince that please do not try to administer justice on your own. So now that Dandaniti is no longer in the hand of the prince, what is his role in the princely state? So then the focus clearly shifts to Varta, i.e. policy. And therefore, you can see Baroda state then goes and focuses on public works, infrastructure, commerce, industry, education, and so on. And a lot of this hard work meant that Baroda would become one of the most prosperous states. And even today, the part of Gujarat, which was Baroda, is clearly one of the most industrialized places in the whole country. So I've now given you a very long range history going back to the epics and even before the epics to all the way to the 19th century. The idea here was to give you a flavor of the huge amount of thought and thinking that has gone on over thousands of years into the art of governance and the principles of governance as opposed to the form of government. And this entire area of work, unfortunately, is very ill served. As I said, a little bit of work is there on the Arthashastra. People like to pull out random quotes from Arthashastra and quote them here and there, but nobody thinks about it as a part of a wider set of intellectual tradition that has existed for a very, very long time. And the purpose of my coming here and giving this lecture is the hope that I can get young scholars and professors, and older scholars and professors as well, to go out there and mine this very, very rich pool of intellectual thought, and some of it to understand our past, but I'm sure there is lots in there that can be even applied today. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Sanyal, for giving us a flavor of Bharat's history and the dynamic Bharat perspective on governance through the ages. The significance of Dharma in Puranic Bharatiya Raj, which was explained by you, sir, truly finds relevance today more than ever, I think. Right. So having graced us with his profound colloquium yesterday, I invite Swami Shama Chaitanya to kindly bestow his blessings upon our esteemed audience today as well.
We had a good interaction yesterday, and it was very enlightening because I was a student of political science and I taught the subject for a while in Delhi University. To listen to Dr. Sanyal was very, very enriching. That if you ask yourself very briefly, 5 minutes with you on this, why we do not know about our tradition. To start with, recently I had a conversation with a friend of mine, a senior, who is the Dean of Social Sciences in the Kriya University. He was framing the syllabus and we had a discussion. And he said, I'm just trying to frame methods of knowledge. And I asked him, so what are the Indian elements in that methodology you are teaching to your BA students? He said, what do you mean by Indian methods of knowledge? Is there anything called Indian methods of knowledge? And this is a professor, a PhD from Oxford. But nobody has time to actually figure out what was our intellectual tradition. We had epistemology, but nobody knows about it. Similarly, we have Pusa and others who are doing literature. If you ask them, have they heard about a text called Kavya Sastra? I'm sure Delhi University doesn't teach you this. You haven't heard of Sahitya Darpana. You have heard about Kavya in English literature? Oh, you really? That's wonderful. But I've talked to a lot of people. You talk about hermeneutics, how to interpret texts. You know about Foucault's and Derrida's and Gadamer's, but you haven't heard about the Mimamsa Darshana, where there is a whole discourse how to interpret a text. You will be surprised to know we had a wonderful talk on governance. During the British period, there were Sanskrit scholars appointed by the British to assist the justices in courts, because there was a whole lot of jurisprudence and you had to pay attention. If you are administering Hindu law, you need to take the help of people who will interpret the laws. But no, nobody. It all started in the 1830s and 40s, where the colonial masters thought how to destroy these people. The only way was to disconnect them from their cultural and intellectual tradition. One best way to destroy us was to destroy the validity of our knowledge systems. Disconnect them. You know, the situation is like this. You have a lot of orphanages where they pick up a child and the boy or girl is taken to an orphanage and then he's grown up, generally by Christian missionaries that do it,
And then he's allowed to go home, but they tell that child, you're going home, yeah, but your mother is a witch. You got to be careful. The child goes, meets the mother, but never goes close enough. That is what the secular, so-called secular, I mean, by the way, I was a Marxist when I was in Delhi University, so don't think that I'm very biased. I studied political science, which was basically Marxism. There was no political theory. You're not reading everything. You're just reading Marxist theory in Delhi University, and you're calling it political science. So you create a kind of an anxiety that if you go closer, deeper into your own religious, cultural, philosophical tradition, you will cease to be a thinking person. You're going to disable yourself. So they are creating in you a kind of affirmation crisis where you have doubts about who you are. Right? It's gaslighting. They want to destroy your self-confidence so you do not know in the we had 2-3 Brihaspatis. We also have Charvaka. It's called Brihaspati Sutra. So we had very secular, very, very rationalist and materialistic thinkers as well. But the problem is the entry into this whole world or universe or domain of different discourses is through language. Many of you, those of you in English language, you have heard about Saussure. Do you know Saussure taught Sanskrit whole of his life? Anybody told you this? He was a professor of Sanskrit till he retired in Switzerland. He wrote linguistics because he read Ashtadhyayi. He picked up that, oh, they have such a wonderful discourse and language. He read Bhakyapadya, he read Ashtadhyayi, he read Mahabhashya, and then he gave theory, he created a theory, and then you have a lot of universities adopting linguistics. How old is the linguistics in the West? In India, it's 2000 years old, even earlier. So what I'm saying is, as Professor Sanyal advised, that let's get back to the roots. And recently, in JNU, very interestingly, they had a seminar where they called Sudipto Kaviraj, who was teaching there earlier. He was one of our teachers. Now he's sitting in, I think, SUNY Binghamton. And he was speaking to them, and he said, one big mistake I have done is that I did not learn Sanskrit. Because there's so much of rich discourses. You know about Oedipus complex, you know about Electra complex. Have you heard about Shakuntala complex? Karna complex? Why not? Because there is a kind of, they have withdrawal legitimacy. There is a withdrawal of legitimacy from your own cultural idioms and tools and concepts. They have made you poorer by telling you that is dangerous. And the trend continues. And the younger people, but I tell you, Sanskrit is not an easy language. I had learned a little early, and after I left my job and I went back and I tried to pick up, it's not easy. So those of you who are younger, I would say that if you want to learn the language, you have to make an entry. And then you see, and what Professor said, that you can study. There is loads and loads of literature available. You can have 50,000 PhDs only on Mahabharata. So much of literature. But provided you know the language. And many people, I talked to somebody, he said, Gita is all destroying and this and that. He said something. I said, okay, I'm quite happy with you. Can you just explain 3 verses? If actually this is a treatise on war, he's sending somebody to the war, why should he give a philosophical discourse on what is self, what is the cosmos, why it was created? If you want to tell somebody, go beat somebody up, would you tell him about philosophy? Will he go? No. Bhagavad Gita is not a discourse on war, but some people, there's one Shruti Kapila who is teaching in Cambridge, and they get good assignments to criticize their tradition. That's fine enough, not a problem. But see, if somebody has written it's actually promotion of violence and stuff like that, just because you have not read the text, you're reading some English lines about it. So I asked this friend of mine, who is apparently a professor and sitting in Pizza, I said, can you explain first 3 verses of chapter 13? He said, I don't know, some bunkum. He read the English. I said, no, read the Sanskrit and tell me what is written there. Why should be Krishna talking about Kshetra and Kshetrajya if he's trying to, goad somebody to go and kill somebody? Why should you do that? So I don't want to take your time. I just want to tell you briefly that if you want to unravel the mystery, the secret, the richness of your tradition, we have to reconnect ourselves, and the reconnection is through language. And you have to learn that language, you have to give some time. Then only it's going to be possible. There were so many wonderful things about Panchatantra, Hitopadesa, there's so many things, you know. Another small thing I want to mention before I go. A friend of mine who is a professor in JNU wanted to start a course on Indian intellectual tradition. By the way, he was a Marxist again. Now he's trying to sell himself as a Gandhian because he's tired of Marxism. So one other professor told him that what do you mean by Indian political thought? Indians never had any political thought. This is the belief. When you it's like that bad faith. You deliberately stick to a bad faith and you want to survive with it. You're blindfolded. Who can liberate you? I mean, you just have to rediscover yourself. I don't want to take much of your time. You have to start your own journey. You start to figure out what is. Somebody says your tradition is very bad, it is destroying, it's backward, this and that. Fine enough. And I told that friend of mine, I'm ready to have a discussion with you on Bhagavad Gita, but have you read the book? Would you like to discuss Shakespeare with me if I have not read the book? And you are expecting me to have a discussion with you on Gita when you have not read the book. You have read, somebody has said something. And that is the way we know about our tradition, because finally, another 20 years, all the experts in Sanskrit and our tradition are sitting in Germany, in France, in America, and England. They are studying Sanskrit. Here, Sanskrit is considered to be a very, regressive thing. You should not study, it is destroying. Choice is yours, because you are going to decide the future, young masters. We are kind of getting it slowly. So I wish you all the best, but please give it a thought that if you want to rediscover yourself, it's going to be through your intellectual tradition, and you need to reconnect. Have that much. You want to criticize? No problem. Reconnect. Study the text. Thank you so much.
Good to have you today. I thank all the esteemed speakers of this inaugural session for making us richer with your views and augmenting our modern knowledge with instances from Bharatiya Gyan Parampara as well as significance of Sub-Sindhu region. Concluding the ceremony, it is now time to express our gratitude to all those who have made this inaugural ceremony a memorable one. Our first and foremost gratitude to Principal Professor Ravi Narayankar for this opportunity and platform, and IQAC Director Professor Kusha Tiwari for being anchor to our efforts. I would like to acknowledge the invaluable contributions of our Conference Director Professor Ruchika Ramakrishnan and Conference Convener Dr. Mukta Rohsidi, whose guidance and support have been pivotal in steering this conference towards success. Thanks to Conference Co-Convener Dr. Megha Jain and Secretary Dr. Romsa Shukla. The conference is the brainchild of these people. To our dedicated conference committee conveners and co-conveners, Professor Kavita Arora, Dr. Masramji, Dr. Pavan, Dr. Jaspreet, Dr. Vinod Sir, and my fellow colleagues. Your meticulous planning and attention to the detail and countless hours of hard work have ensured the smooth execution of this ceremony. Lastly, but not the least, I express gratitude to all the delegates, paper presenters, and participants for their interest in this 3-day intellectual extravaganza. We wish success for this conference and hope that a meaningful discourse catches momentum among the panel experts, scholars, and other stakeholders. Thank you all. I now request all of you to please rise for the national anthem. Thank you. Post inaugural session, we have arranged a dedicated plenary session on rediscovering and expanding international economic frontiers. Please look forward and join us in the subsequent session. Arrangements for tea have been arranged in the room number 447. Thank you.